One big reason you'll have to rename things in the model is if the person who designed the database used outdated or misguided naming standards. For example, here shows just one table from a very large database that I've encountered in my consulting work. In fairness, the original database was created back in the days of SQL Server 2000, before schemas were available as a kind of namespace container. So all the tables have a TBL prefix on the name, followed by the name of the functional area, subscript here for subscription area, and then the table name, such as member. Complicating things further, some of the tables have a 3-character subscript on the name, such as SMI, none of which any current employees of the company have any idea what the meaning is. Now the fields in all the tables follow a similar pattern, with a data type prefix, a functional area name, and in fact, no one knows why the table that I show here uses both member and subscript in various field names. Nobody has any idea. And then finally, the field name, what it consists of, website, username, address, address to, and so forth. Unfortunately, the data type prefixes are unreliable because over the years it's been necessary to change data types here and there, which isn't necessarily a breaking change, but without changing the field name, which is a breaking change. The nightmare of this database design has persisted for years because the company has a large complex website built on it, as well as various support applications and tools. Making all the required changes to the applications and stored procedures would be a nightmare if any field names changed. So as you can imagine, I had to spend a ton of time cleaning up the names in the entity data model that I created for the database. It was time well spent, though, because we were able to simplify the names, clean up inconsistencies, and change names that made no sense at all without changing the underlying database design. Fortunately, all of the AdventureWorks databases use a much saner naming convention, so there isn't nearly as much work to do. But there are still things to refine that will make the model much easier to use in an application. And with Entity Framework starting in version 4 and later, so a few versions ago, the Entity Data Model Wizard has already made entity and entity set names singular and plural by default, which saves a lot of the work required in earlier versions. It isn't perfect, but it's good enough by far and away most of the time. Another benefit is that you can fix database object misspellings. Sometimes you can't change the misspellings in the database because of application dependencies, but you don't have to perpetuate the problem in your new model and applications. In cleaning up the model, I'm going to start with the name of entities, because lots of model features depend on good entity names. For the most part, these are good entity names within the AdventureWorks LT model, things like customer, product, customer address. They're simple and clearly indicate the type of data that each represents. And the plural form doesn't cause any problems. But there are a few refinements that will make the model easier and more convenient to use. All right, here we are back in the model. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this product color back to its default. Unfortunately, it's a non-standard color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select Product Model, come over here to Properties, and copy that value. Do Control-C, and then I'll select Product and change that value from red to that 0122.204. Okay, so now product doesn't stand out quite so much. All right, first thing I want to look at is the product model and product description tables here. And as you can see, it has a many-to-many table called Product Model Product Description. So that name right there is pretty unwieldy. It was obviously created from concatenating together the two tables that it is the many-to-many table for. So I want to change that. And then another thing about this is within these tables, there really isn't a really good reason to keep the product in any of the table names, because they're all associated with the product table. And if we're going to rename entities to get rid of the redundant product name, we may as well remove it from product category as well, not just these three tables that I have shown right now. Okay, but before we do that, there's a problem with product description. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here into product description. I'm going to select the name again. Goes into edit mode, and get rid of product because I want this table just to be called description. And I'll hit enter. And I get this error. It says entity type description already exists in the model or conflicts with the entity container name, or there's an existing property named description in this entity's inheritance change. Please specify another name. All right, I'll just send that away. And as you can see, it was the last option or the last possibility. This entity has a property called description, and under the rules of entity framework, you can't have an entity with the same name as one of its properties. Okay, so I'm going to hit the escape key to undo that. And I'll talk a little bit later about how we can get around that problem. Unfortunately, it's not a real pretty picture. So I'm going to start making some of these changes. So as I discussed, I'm going to get rid of product out of this entity name. I'm going to change this one to just model description. Because keep in mind, these are names that I'm going to have to use within my application code. And constantly working with long variable names is fine. .NET supports it. If I need long variable names, great. But they just are a lot of things I have to type. Even with IntelliSense, I have to pick them out of a list. It's just a lot easier to have concise entity names, as long as they're clear and uniquely identify and appropriately identify the entity that they are naming. And then I'm also going to go up to product category and name this just category. All right. Now, keep in mind that you may not agree with my rationale for making some of these changes. That's okay. I want to show you some techniques you can use to clean up the model. You need to follow consistent naming standards that are appropriate for your shop, your company, your environment, and the applications that are going to use this model, because these are the names that are going to be used within the application. Keep in mind, I'm not changing the name of the tables within the database, just the names within the model. It's going to be used by the application. Okay, so a couple other entities have fairly unwieldy names: sales order header and sales order details. These names get really tiresome to type a lot in an application, even with IntelliSense. So I'm going to change those entity names to shorter, but still very understandable names. So I'm just going to call sales order header order. Okay, still works. Again, within the taxonomy of this corporation, of the applications, whatever, order works. And then for sales order detail, I'm going to get really wild and just call it line item. Because there's a lot of places where this is the line item of an order. That's a more understandable entity name. Now, that may or may not be ideal, but it depends on the application. But order item could work, order detail could work, or you may have a custom name that makes more sense within your environment. If you do, go for it. Okay, next thing I want to address is the name of the view entities. They follow the naming convention of the database. The entities within the model follow the naming convention of the database, and so they have a leading V in the name. Also, two of the names, V product and description and V product model catalog description, describe data, whereas one of them, V get all category, is an action name. Okay, so I'm going to rename all of these to get rid of the V, and I'm going to change that action name. Okay, so here's V product and description. Get rid of that. V get all category. So this is an action name. So I'm going to change this to category list so that it's more consistent with the other views. And then here's the third and last view. I'll widen that a bit so you can see it. V product model catalog description. So I'm just going to get rid of the V there, widen a little bit more. That's too much. Okay, and so now we have the views have a little bit saner names. Now keep in mind that product model catalog description is still a pretty long name, but it is descriptive, so I'm going to leave that be. One important thing to understand about renaming entities is that since this model is set to automatically singularize and pluralize names, when you change the names in the designer, the entity set names change as well to stay in sync with the entity name. So, for example, I'll come back down here to product category, right there, and go over to the properties window. So this is another place where you can change the name. Here's the name that I changed. And as you can see, the entity set name, which was product categories, is now just categories. So as much as it can, Entity Framework is going to keep the names in sync. Now, if the plural name just doesn't make any sense, I can change the name here and to whatever might be appropriate for the pluralization of category, if it's not categories, and that will break the automatic updating of names when I change the pluralization, singularization, coordination that Entity Framework does. Okay, so you have flexibility. You can break out of that requirement. Even though it's in effect for the entire model, you can break it for an individual entity. And by the way, once the model is created, wait for Visual Studio to think there for a second. Once the model's created, you can change that using this pluralize new objects property. Set to true, so that's why product categories was changed to categories when I changed the singular entity name. But I can change that to false, and then now I can make changes to names, and Entity Framework won't keep them in sync. You'll probably want to spend some time cleaning up the names of entity properties as well. There are two broad types of changes that you'll want to consider. The first is making entity property names consistent with entity names. And second, improving the names for use in an application. So the first reason applies to some of the changes that I've made to the model so far. I've changed some of the entity names, such as sales order header, to just order. And so there's some properties that make use of the name that I want to make consistent. And again, that's going to make for better names for use in an application so that there isn't an inconsistency between what properties are called relative to the entities that they're on or refer to. So what I'm going to do now is look at entity scalar properties, and then afterwards take a look at navigation properties, because those could need changing as well. The first thing I want to do is change some property names to make them consistent with the changes to the entity names that I made. Okay, so the place I first want to start is recall that I changed sales order header to order. So in this case, for consistency, I should also change the sales order number property to just order number. Developers are going to expect the name to start with O, presumably, so this change is going to make it easier to find the correct property, or even maybe just number would make more sense. So the first thing I want to do is on the order entity, and I'll change the sales order number to just order number. Now I want to go down to the category entity, and because I changed the name of the entity to just category, I want to change product category ID to just category ID. And then similarly here, I want to change parent product category ID to just parent category ID. So again, these are changes that make the properties consistent with the names of the entities. Next, I want to go to the line item table, right there. And I want to change the sales order ID to just order ID. In fact, that name started out inconsistent because you would think it would be the sales order header ID, but Microsoft chose not to do that. But now these are consistent between the two entities. This is very advantageous when you have a primary key and foreign keys, It behooves you to name them the same because Entity Framework does some efficiencies for you in naming of objects and so forth, and seeing relationships between things that it wouldn't necessarily be able to if the property names were different. So for the most part, I pretty much name primary keys and foreign keys the same. And that really applies only if it's a surrogate primary key, as they all are within the AdventureWorks databases. Okay, similar here. I'm going to just name this the line item ID. All right, now I want to go to the product entity. And this change arises because I changed the name of the product category table. I want the name to be consistent. And in particular, I changed the name to category ID, so I just want category ID here. And then similar here, this is now just model, so I'll make it model ID. All right, next I'll go over to the model entity here. Let me widen this a bit so you can see all the names. Some of the names are really wide. Okay. And I'm going to change product model ID to just model ID. That's another naming standard that I like, where the primary key is name of the table ID. Makes it very easy to see when you're writing code using this to understand what entity this belongs to. All right, now I'm going to go over to the model description and change the product model ID to just model ID, again because of an entity name change. All right, a couple things I want to do up in the views here. Up in category list, remember this is one of the views. I've already removed the V from the name. So here I have parent product category name. I just want that to be parent category name. So again, this is consistent with other changes that I've made in the entities. Same thing with product category name. I just want that to be category name. And then finally, product category ID is just now category ID. All right, we're getting close to the changes that I'm going to make. So here in product and description, I want to change the product model to just model. And then in the product model category description view, I want to change the product model ID once again to just model ID. Okay, so that's the first set of changes. Now what I want to tackle is to fix the problem that I encountered with the product description entity. The model designer again won't let an entity name be the same as one of the property names, even as an intermediate step to changing both. You could go to the XML for the conceptual and mapping models and make the change, but that's pretty tedious and very error-prone. An easier way is to just bite the bullet and rename the property to a temporary name, rename the entity, and then rename that property again to its permanent name. Okay, so let's go down to the description table here, or what ultimately will be the description table. And I'm going to start by changing this name to Floyd. Okay, obviously a meaningless name, but it's a temporary name that I use a lot. You might prefer to use foobar. This isn't going to persist, so don't worry about what you change it to, as long as it's a valid property name. Okay, now that I don't have a description property, I can finally change the name of the entity to description. And that works just fine. This time I don't get the error message. Okay, and now I need to change this back to something meaningful. So I'm going to change this to product description. Description. And then the last thing I want to do is change this to make it consistent with the entity name to just description ID. You can argue, very legitimately, that I really haven't made an improvement in the model by swapping the product description entity name and the description property name. But my rationalization is that it's likely in code that you're going to reference the entity more often than the property. So the change is probably going to save a few keystrokes over time. Okay? But maybe there's a better thing that you can call product description. I don't know. Okay. Then one other change here. I want to change the product description ID now to just description ID, so it's consistent with the change that I made in the description table. Okay, so those are various names that shorten things as well as make them consistent with other changes I had previously made. So now I want to tackle the other broad type of property name change. The sort of thing that you should consider doing are changes that improve the names that you use within an application. This is even more subjective than entity name changes, but there are a couple changes that would improve this model's usability within an application. The first one is in the customer entity. Right there. So I'm going to change email address to just email. Now, the longer name, email address, is a bit redundant, unless maybe this property were a Boolean to indicate that the customer has an email address. But that probably isn't really a useful field to have. Email identifies what it is. Everyone knows what it is. Why bother with a longer name? Just easier to use in an application, shorter and more concise. Shorter is good. And then in the order table, I'm going to change a couple of the names to their full name. Rather than tax AMT, I'm going to make this tax amount. Abbreviations can be good, but some of the ones that are used in AdventureWorks LT don't really have much benefit. I tend to prefer not to use abbreviations in programming names like this. Widely used acronyms, such as for product URL in the product model catalog description entity, are clear and pretty acceptable. Besides, most names in the database are spelled out. So I really see no reason to use tax AMT here. Okay, similarly within line item, I'm going to change the order quantity, once Visual Studio stops thinking, to type out quantity. Okay. Just makes more sense. AdventureWorks just doesn't use abbreviations very often, so I have to think about it every time I look at that name. So it's probably just something in my makeup. Okay, then another change that I want to make is to modified date, and this applies to all of the entities. Modified date is redundant. Modified identifies what it is. Modified is a date time field type. So modified date is just longer than it needs to be. So I'm just real quickly going to go through and change all these. Fortunately, this doesn't apply to any views, so I don't need to change any of those. But this also kind of points up that some kind of changes that you consider making can be very tedious. But overall, I think the benefit of making this kind of a change, even though it's tedious for me as the model designer now, is just going to make the model simpler, easier to use, more sensible, whatever. So I think these kinds of changes are worthwhile to make. Of course, had I been the one designing the database in the first place, I would have just called it modified anyway. And so then it just would have picked up the proper name within the model. Okay, one more. Hopefully I got them all. but as I continue to work with the model, I can notice if I missed any and change them at that point. So I'm done with those kind of changes for now. There are a number of other changes that you could consider, but I chose not to make them at this time. For example, address line 1 and address line 2 could simply be line 1 and line 2, or address 1 and address 2. But that really doesn't seem to be that much of an improvement. Online order flag in the order entity implies its Boolean data type with the flag suffix, but its inclusion makes it a bit clearer as to the type of information that the property contains. Category name in the category list entity maybe should just be name, but since the view entity is likely to be used just for reporting, the current name is clearer even in the context. Another problem that you may have to fix is the case where a table in the database has the same name as one of its fields, which is fine in the database, but doesn't work in Entity Framework. In this case, the Entity Data Model Wizard is going to add a 1 to the property name, so you probably want to change the property name to something more useful and relevant. This doesn't occur in the AdventureWorks LT database, though.